Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. I'm back! I know I've been gone for the summer. I took a bit of a social media break all the way around. I wasn't on Instagram, I wasn't on Facebook, I wasn't on YouTube. I just kind of took a little bit of a break and a breather, but I'm back now. And for this week's writing tips, and actually for the next 12 weeks, I'm going to be doing a series called The Elements of Writing. And we're going to be talking about the different areas. We're going to be talking about conflict and pacing and setting and things like that. I'm not doing them in any kind of order, so it's not like the most important thing comes first and then I work my way through. Just going to kind of do the ones that just I felt like researching this week, to be honest. I am hoping that this will be good for people who are beginners or intermediate writers, maybe somebody who needs a little bit of a reminder. But hey, if you're an expert writer and you're in here and you've stumbled upon these and you just need a reminder about what some of these things are, more power to you. So this week, for this week's writing tips, we're going to actually be working on plot and pacing. To me, plot and pacing kind of go hand in hand, which is why I've kind of put them together. You need a plot, and we'll talk a little bit about conflict in 1 or 2 weeks. I'm not sure which one, but we're especially going to talk about plot in terms of pacing and how we work on pacing. So just to give you an idea of what pacing is it's like a thing that controls the speed and the rhythm of the story and leads the readers through and pulls them through the different events that are happening within the story. It can refer to how fast or slow the story unfolds and how time elapses within each scene and within the story as a whole. So pacing can also be used to show characters aging and the effects of story and events. So really, though, I mean, just boil it down to a very simple definition. Pacing is the ebb and flow of how a story goes. I'm actually going to use movies as an example, even though we're talking about writing. Obviously, this could apply to like storytelling when you're doing screenwriting, and it also pertains to nonfiction too, because pacing is very important. If you start boring the reader, they're not going to want to keep reading your book, no matter what it's about. So with movies, a lot of times what happens in film is, they'll write the screenplay. It'll be 220 pages, which is on average, one page is supposed to be 1 minute of screen time. And then they film a lot of it, right? And sometimes they film a lot more than what they've actually what they're planning on doing. So they'll film extra stuff. They'll do extra scenes here and they'll do extra scenes there. And then when they're sitting there editing the movie and they're splicing it together, they start having to make decisions about what needs to go in and what needs to not go in. Of course, they're also thinking about things like cinematography and shots and things like that. But let us focus on just the story. So I'm thinking, if you've ever watched Lord of the Rings, and if you saw the theatrical version, it's very long. I know some people who just flat out refuse to go see it because it was so long. And then there's an extended version with all these extra scenes in it. And for the fans, the diehard fans who love Lord of the Rings, those scenes are great, because it feels like it adds something. But for the theatrical release for a general audience, they had to make decisions on what to cut, what to leave on the cutting room floor that didn't help with the pacing. And so there were scenes that were removed because they were slow, or they're interesting, but they're not really that important to the actual overall plot and story or characterization. And so they start cutting those. They start going away and they're left, And so a lot of times you'll see this in movies. You'll get the DVD or the Blu-ray and you'll watch the behind the scenes stuff, and there's scenes that are left behind, all these deleted scenes. And you're like, oh. And sometimes when I watch those, because I love watching deleted scenes, I'll be like, yeah, I can see why you cut that out. That was really bad. Sometimes I don't think that it was a good decision. I think that they left out like a whole plot or storyline. Chronicles of Riddick was one of those movies where they took out one of their subplots completely. Like they just went through and cut out every scene that had this subplot in it. And to me, that ruined the movie. And I get why people were so confused when they were watching it, because it was missing an important element that they just decided to cut because the studio didn't like it. So when we're writing books, we kind of have to do the same thing. When we're writing, we write all these scenes and stories, and I'm doing physical, but we're all typing. But typing up the story, and what if it doesn't work? And how do you know it's not working? So the first thing that you need to look at is scenes that are slow. So cutting scenes that are slow. Things where the characters are just chit-chatting with each other. We're going to talk about dialogue a little bit too, and we're going to talk about chit-chatting, where the not much happens in that scene. For 2 or 3 pages, nothing's happening. There's no character arc going on. There's no characterization. They're just wandering, and I see this a lot in fantasy books, usually earlier drafts that I'm editing, where the character's just walking somewhere. They're riding their horses or they're walking, and it takes them forever to get there. And as a reader, it feels like it's taking forever to get there. Time to fast forward. Okay, so we take out those scenes because they're slowing down the pacing. The reader's getting bored. If your reader is skipping ahead, then you're going too slow, right? And so you need to think of that too when you're reading your own book. It's hard when we're reading it, to edit our own. So beta readers, give them the instructions. I've mentioned before in the beta reader video that tell them exactly what you're looking for. And if what you're looking for is, hey, can you tell me when the plot seems really slow? They know what to look for. And so they're looking for those spots and they can point them out to you. So the other thing that you need to do has to do with research. And this is a problem in historical fiction, but also in nonfiction, where we get all this wonderful resources. I mean, there's hundreds of books on the subject that you want to write about. So let's say you're writing a historical novel set in Victorian times, and you want to include as many rich details of Victorian life in there as possible, right? So you've done a ton of research. You've researched for months, possibly reading books. You've got things about how cooking was done and all that stuff. And then you start writing your story, and it kind of reads more like a history book about the Victorian times. And there's no plot and there's no characterization. I just finished editing a book that had this problem where tons of rich details, but I don't know what the characters want and I don't know what they're doing, and it felt so slow sometimes. And so what I'm challenging you to do is leave in the details that help make your world feel richer, but make sure that they are not bogging down your story. Because that slows it down, right? So for example, you can insert little things like language and stuff into the story to make it sound interesting without giving us a 2-paragraph thing about how people talked back then, because that's slowing down the story. Whatever you choose to do, you have to keep in mind that your research, some of it is going to be left at the table and it's not going to make its way into the book. Okay. So the same thing with fiction, with writing, doing your own world building. Of course, if you're doing fantasy or sci-fi, you might have all these rich details of your world and they might not all make it in. So Lord of the Rings, again, famous for this because Tolkien had made an entire world with stories and histories and poems, and those didn't all get in the book. And that's because it would have slowed down the book. And I think some people would even argue that there's stuff that's still in the books that could have been taken out. But that's the thing. Some of this information is information that you'll know in the back of your head so that you can kind of make the characters complex and the story complex, but we don't need to know all those details or save it for another book. So then you need to also ask some questions. You need to ask yourself, is this part really important? Does it move the plot forward? Does it add more to the characterization? If it doesn't, maybe it doesn't belong here. Or maybe this needs to be tightened a little bit. What I mean by tightened is maybe you'll have 4 paragraphs about them going going somewhere and then walking, and it's kind of slow, and you know it's kind of slow because they're just walking. Maybe we just need a paragraph. We tighten that up, just a paragraph about how long it took, and maybe a few details about what they did along the journey, but we don't need every single detail because that's not important. It's not adding to the plot. Nothing happened during the journey that has changed the quest or the plot or the characters, so let's just leave that out, right? We don't need it. Then we have to look at something that I call like quiet sections. I think quiet sections in books, even action-packed books, are really important because your reader needs to take a breath. You'll notice this when you watch action movies. They give you a breath either with comedy, that they interlude with little comedic moments, or they have these moments where the characters stop and they talk to one another, or they share an intimate moment, or they cry. Something happens to kind of slow us down for a moment before we build again. And I think that those parts are really important. I don't think of it as like a roller coaster, right? Just think of it as you have these pauses, and then you can continue to build. And those pauses should build character, move the plot forward, and then you can keep going. But you got to give your readers a bit of a break to catch their breath. If it's action, it definitely can feel very rushed then. And then so this is again pacing. We talk about parts being slow. There's also parts that can be too fast, and it can be going and going and going, and your reader starts to feel almost like agitated because it's not letting up, and so they need a little bit of a break as they're going. That's part of the pacing. And then you're probably thinking, well, how do I know when those parts are? I think some of it is an intuition, and that's built over time. I don't think people have an innate knowledge of when the pacing feels off. It's something that I think a lot of writers struggle with. Even seasoned veteran authors still struggle with pacing sometimes. So that's where your beta readers come in, and that's where practice comes in. The hardest part when you're playing around with your book and tightening things up and taking things out is letting go of the parts that you really like, where you'll write this paragraph, or you'll write this scene and you'll be like, oh, this scene's so good, I love it, it makes me laugh. And then you realize, especially after you finish the book and you come back and you're revising, and you're like, oh, this scene doesn't add anything to the characterization, doesn't really teach us anything new about these characters, has nothing to do with the plot, it was just funny and fun. What I do is I usually take those out and save them. So I work in Scrivener. I'll pull those scenes out and set them aside. They're just for me. They might make it back in later if I've made enough changes that I feel like it fits again, but I just kind of set them aside. But I take them out. And it's really hard sometimes to take them out because I think that they belong there and I want them to be there, but I don't think that they do. And usually when I have like that moment where I'm like, oh, I don't know if this should go here or not, and then I send something to a beta reader, their response is, this doesn't go here. This is too slow, or I don't like this part, or things like that. And the same thing applies to books that I edit. I will have authors who will leave little comments for me, and they'll say, I'm not sure about this part, or this part feels a little slow to me. And when I look at it and read it, I'm like, yeah, they're right. It is a little slow. And here's what I think you can do to kind of speed it up. Or here's what I think you can cut in order to get the pacing back on track. But I really challenge you to just look at plot and pacing almost like you would a film. And you are editing that film, and you have to determine whether certain scenes need to stay or go. And most likely there's a couple scenes that need to go. I doubt that every single thing that you've written is perfect and wonderful and fits the pacing beautifully. I think the biggest challenge for pacing and really getting the hang of it is that it's really difficult when you have multiple storylines going on. So if you have a character here and character B there and character C here, and they're all kind of going together in different directions, it can definitely be a little challenging to keep the pacing right throughout the story. Pacing is also really difficult when you're writing a quiet book. I call quiet books more like literary books that are very drama heavy. It is harder to find that ebb and flow in a book that doesn't have constant crisis and conflicts and climaxes and action scenes. To make sure that you're not boring your reader, but you're also creating a dynamic story and character. And for that, really, it's about the characterization in those books. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the weeks to come. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday, except for when I'm taking summer breaks, apparently. I also have a website, and I am an editor for hire. I do freelance editing. You can find me at galaxy-ink.com. The link is in the description below. I will also see if I can figure out how to add it to the screen. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.